For 300 years, humanity had played by the rules of the Galactic Coalition. They bowed when asked to bow. They stayed in their designated trade zones. They never reached beyond the invisible boundaries drawn by older, stronger species who saw Earth as nothing more than a young child learning to walk among giants. The humans were the weakest in the coalition. Everyone knew this. Everyone accepted this. Even humanity itself had internalized this truth, believing that survival meant compliance. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the observation deck of Station Kepler 7, watching the stars beyond the transparent aluminum walls. She had dedicated her entire life to maintaining peaceful relations with the Zethian Empire, a species that had colonized 12 star systems and commanded respect through advanced weaponry and ancient knowledge. The Zethians had chosen Earth as a secondary trade hub, a decision that boosted humanity's economy and global status. For the first time, humans felt like they were truly part of something larger than themselves. But that feeling wouldn't last. The destruction came without warning. No demands. No ultimatum. No declaration of war. The Zethian warships simply appeared above 3 major human settlements, Tokyo, Lagos, and New Delhi, and began erasing them from existence. 80 million people died in the first hour. The rest of humanity watched through screens and satellites as their cities burned, as their families disappeared in nuclear fire, as ash settled over vast stretches of land that would remain poisoned for generations. The Zethians had a message. A single transmission that would be broadcast across every human frequency: you have chosen to ignore our warnings. You have allowed your kind to develop technology that threatens our interests. This is what happens to those who ignore the Zethian Empire. Surrender all advanced weaponry and submit to permanent governance, or the next strikes will leave no survivors. No one understood what warnings they were talking about. No human government had received any demands or ultimatums. The Zethians had simply decided, in their ancient alien minds, that humanity was becoming too much of a potential problem. And they had decided to solve that problem the way the strong have always solved problems when dealing with the weak, through overwhelming force and the demonstration of absolute power. Sarah Chen learned about her daughter's death, her 8-year-old girl who lived in New Delhi with her ex-husband, on the news broadcast. She learned about it alongside 7 billion other people who suddenly understood that the coalition meant nothing. That treaties meant nothing. That human life meant nothing to those who held the power. And, in that moment, something fundamental shifted. Humanity had been given a choice by the universe itself: submit and fade away as a servile species, a permanent underclass managing resources for their masters, their children's children never knowing what it meant to be free. Or they could do something different. Something unexpected. Something that no one, especially not the Zethians, would anticipate from a species they had already classified as defeated. They could stop playing nice. Dr. Chen wiped her eyes and walked toward the communication terminal. She had contacts in the military, in research facilities, in underground laboratories where humans had continued developing weapons despite coalition restrictions. She had access to files that were supposed to be locked away forever. And she had something the Zethians didn't expect any human to possess: absolutely nothing left to lose. As she began making calls, as she started pulling together the fragmented pieces of a species that had just been broken, the first real question emerged in the minds of every human alive: how does a species that plays nice suddenly stop playing nice? And what happens to the enemy who makes them? What followed would become known as the greatest strategic gamble in human history. Not because it was the most elegant. Not because it was the most technologically advanced. But because it came from somewhere the Zethians had never bothered to look: from the desperate, terrified, grieving hearts of a species with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The Zethian Empire had made a catastrophic mistake. They had assumed that humanity, because they were weak, would stay weak. They had not accounted for what happens when you push a creature into a corner and remove all of their fears. They had not accounted for what humans do when they finally, truly, completely stop playing nice. The age of human submission had ended. The age of something far more dangerous was beginning. The television screens went black for exactly 7 minutes. No signal. No static. Just absolute darkness. Around the world, billions of people reached for their phones, their computers, their emergency radios, anything that could tell them what was happening. But there was nothing. No news. No updates. No emergency broadcasts. Just silence so complete it felt like the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible it couldn't yet comprehend. When the signal returned, it came through every screen simultaneously. The image was simple. A Zethian delegation, their tall frames covered in the crystalline armor that had made them the military rulers of the coalition, standing in front of a star map. The Zethians had no mouths as humans understood them. Their communication came through a combination of gestures, light patterns across their skin, and a translator that converted their language into every human tongue at once. The message was delivered in a tone so emotionless it made the words somehow more terrifying. The human civilization has been warned repeatedly about its technological advancement. The coalition has determined that humanity poses an increasing threat to regional stability. To facilitate the return of peace, and to emphasize the severity of our concerns, we have implemented corrective measures. The image shifted. Thermal imaging showed the 3 cities before the strikes, glowing with the heat of millions of human lives. Then, the strikes came. The cities became superheated voids. The image showed what was once Tokyo, Lagos, and New Delhi as nothing more than expanding waves of destruction, cities turning to ash in seconds. These strikes were precise and purposeful. We have demonstrated the consequences of disobedience. The human species now has 72 hours to meet the following demands. All advanced weaponry must be surrendered to Zethian control. All research facilities working on weapons development must be dismantled. And all human governments must submit to Zethian oversight to ensure compliance moving forward. The face of a human translator appeared briefly. Dr. Marcus Webb, the UN representative to the coalition, looking like a man whose world had just been dismantled. He opened his mouth to say something, but the image cut to black again. For the next 18 hours, chaos consumed Earth. The tallest towers of human civilization crumbled not from explosions, but from the internal collapse of order itself. 3 cities were simply gone. The radiation would kill millions more in the weeks to come as the wind carried contamination across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Hospitals in surrounding regions were immediately overwhelmed. Scientists were already calculating that the long-term environmental damage would affect crop production for years. But the death toll, 80 million in the first hour, wasn't the hardest number to comprehend. It was too large. Human minds couldn't actually process 80 million. Instead, the grief came in smaller, personal ways. A child without parents. A soldier learning his entire unit had been stationed in Tokyo. A grandmother discovering her entire extended family had vanished in an instant. In 100 million homes, people were experiencing the sudden realization that someone fundamental to their existence was simply gone now. And nobody knew what to do. General James Patterson sat in the underground bunker in Washington, D.C., staring at the satellite feeds. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military leader of the United States of America, and he was worthless. Every weapon that mattered had been restricted by the coalition. Every technology that might have been useful had been banned. The Zethians had made sure of it, hiding their oppressive restrictions behind the language of regional security and coalition harmony. The human military had been slowly, deliberately, systematically reduced to a state of practical helplessness. Around the globe, similar conversations were happening in similar bunkers. The military leaders of Earth were all reaching the same conclusion simultaneously: humanity had no way to fight back. The Zethian weapons were too advanced. Their shields could absorb any conventional strike. Their weaponry could destroy cities from space. And there were more of them, dozens of warships in close orbit around Earth, more than enough to glass the entire planet if they decided to. The answer was clear. Surrender. Immediately, completely, unconditionally. But before any government could formally transmit their surrender, something unexpected happened. The internet, which had nearly shut down after the initial strikes, suddenly came alive again. Not with official government communications. Not with mainstream news. but with grassroots messages spreading peer-to-peer through every network node on Earth. The messages came from people like Dr. Sarah Chen. She had moved through the Coalition research station with purpose, her security clearance still valid, her status as a senior researcher still intact. The Zethians were too confident, too certain of human submission, to have immediately revoked her access. She gathered data from 7 different research terminals, encryption keys, weapons specifications, engineering diagrams, computer system layouts. She stole not because she had a plan. She stole because she couldn't bear the thought of humanity going down without at least trying something, anything. In an underground laboratory in the Ural Mountains, a former military scientist named Dmitry Volkov began receiving her files. He wept when he read the specifications for the advanced plasma weapons system that humanity had been forced to abandon 10 years ago. It was still functional, according to the diagrams. Still viable. Hidden in abandoned facilities across Russia, China, and the United States. The Zethians had forced humanity to dismantle them, and humanity had complied. But the blueprints had survived. Within hours, thousands of people were receiving fragments of the stolen information. Scientists, engineers, programmers, military personnel. Ordinary people with extraordinary skills who had been told their entire lives that they were inferior, that their species didn't have what it took to stand alongside the stars. Dr. Patrick Okonkwo, a Nigerian physicist working in a Lagos satellite monitoring station, received files detailing the energy signature patterns that Zethian shields produced. He spent 6 hours analyzing them before understanding what he was looking at. The shields weren't impenetrable. They had a frequency limitation. If you hit them with the right energy pattern at the right frequency, they would destabilize temporarily. Long enough to get through. In Japan, Korea, and India, families huddled together in makeshift shelters, waiting for the radiation clouds to reach them. But, in laboratories, bunkers, and hidden facilities across those same countries, engineers were already being contacted by mysterious messages asking if they wanted to be part of something. Something dangerous. Something that would probably fail. But, something that was better than surrender. Around the world, the underground network grew. Not officially. Not with any government blessing. In fact, the governments were attempting to suppress it. The UN had officially decided to surrender. The United States was transmitting surrender codes. China was negotiating its peaceful transition to Zethian control. Russia was bartering to protect its scientists from retribution. But, beneath the surface, hidden in the spaces between official orders and public compliance, humanity was doing something different. The network called itself the Resistance, though in these early hours, it had no central leadership, no unified strategy, no realistic plan for victory. It had only information, stolen from the Coalition's own archives. It had only people who had lost everything. It had only a desperate, probably futile belief that humanity deserved to at least try. Dr. Chen made her way to a facility in Switzerland, moving through airports where security was too focused on the crisis to properly check credentials. She carried with her physical copies of files, photographs of encrypted data, handwritten notes on specifications that couldn't be transmitted electronically without being detected. She was met by a man named Colonel James Murphy, a career military officer who had spent 20 years watching humanity compromise its values, negotiate away its future, and bow before species who saw them as children at best and parasites at worst. He had decided somewhere in the last 18 hours that his oath was not to the government that served the Zethians. His oath was to humanity itself. What we have here, he said, spreading out the stolen documents on a secure table, is incomplete. We have the weapons specifications, but no manufacturing capacity. The Coalition restricted that deliberately. We have energy signature data, but no way to weaponize it into anything that matters. And even if we could manufacture weapons, we have less than 50 hours before the deadline. We have nothing. Sarah Chen looked at the man and felt something crystallize inside her. The grief was still there. The knowledge that her daughter was gone was still there. But something else was emerging. Something cold and determined. Something that didn't require hope to function. Something that only required a commitment to not make it easy for the people who had decided to exterminate her species. "We have something more important," she said quietly. "We have the fact that they don't know we're doing this. They're so confident, so certain that they've broken us, that they're not even monitoring our communications properly. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll already be far enough along that stopping us becomes difficult." Murphy looked at her for a long moment. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him a list of contacts. Scientists in 15 different countries. Engineers in manufacturing centers. Programmers in hidden servers. Military personnel with access to secret bases. It was incomplete. It was disorganized. It was probably insane. It was also the only chance they had. "I'm proposing that we stop thinking like a species that's been conquered," she said. "I'm proposing that we think like a species that just decided to fight back. And I'm proposing that we do it right now, before the governments can completely shut us down." The radio broadcast reached underground bunkers and hidden facilities simultaneously. It was simple. 5 words that would echo across every secure communication channel on Earth: "They killed our children. Now it's our turn." It was transmitted in 17 languages. It was encrypted so that only the growing network could receive it. And it was the moment that humanity officially, deliberately, irrevocably committed itself to resistance. Above the Earth, the Zethian warships maintained their positions in orbit. Their sensors could detect the increased electromagnetic activity on the planet's surface, but they were too confident to be concerned. Humans were organizing their surrender. Of course they were. Humans always surrendered. It was what they did. The Zethians had made a profound miscalculation. They had assumed that humans, being the weakest species in the coalition, would have the mindset of the weak. That they would be obsequious and obedient and desperate to please their superiors. What they didn't understand was that humans, throughout their entire history, had this strange quality that no amount of power difference could entirely suppress. When humans were cornered, when everything was taken away, when the rules that society was built on were shattered, they didn't become meek. They became something far more dangerous. They became creative. The 48 hours that followed would be remembered as the most intense period of human collaboration in recorded history. Scientists who had been rivals for decades worked side by side. Military personnel who had never trained together coordinated complex operations. Engineers in factories that had been shut down for years restarted equipment with hands shaking from adrenaline and grief. By hour 36 of the deadline, the first prototype of a repurposed plasma cannon was being assembled in an abandoned military facility in Kazakhstan. By hour 42, the first successful shield disruption test was being conducted in an underwater laboratory in the Pacific. By hour 48, something remarkable had been accomplished. Humanity had the weapons, distributed across multiple hidden locations, ready to fire. And the Zethians still had no idea. The response when the Zethians finally realized what was happening would define the next phase of the conflict. But, in this moment, with the 72-hour deadline about to expire and the Zethian delegation waiting for humanity's formal surrender, something unexpected was about to occur. The Zethians had struck expecting humans to break. Instead, they were about to discover that they had simply given humans the only thing that had been missing, a reason to show them exactly how dangerous a species could become when you took away everything they had to lose. The Zethian deadline arrived at precisely 1400 hours Universal Time. The Chancellor of Earth's United Nations stood in the General Assembly Hall, surrounded by representatives from every nation, cameras broadcasting his words to billions of people who were waiting to hear that humanity would surrender. The room was silent. All eyes were on him. And then, something happened that the Zethians had not anticipated. Ambassador David Okafor, who had worked his entire career as a peacemaker, a negotiator, a man dedicated to human compliance, simply walked away from the podium. No words. No statement. No explanation. He walked out of the assembly hall, out of the building, and disappeared into the New York streets. Within moments, automated systems took over. A pre-recorded message began transmitting from UN facilities. But it wasn't the surrender that the Zethians expected. It was something else entirely. A message in the Zethian language, transmitted on their official diplomatic frequency: "We accept the ultimatum to be withdrawn. We have elected to pursue alternative solutions to the current dispute. Negotiations must occur with representation from all human powers. Any further hostile action will be met with defensive responses. We are ready to discuss terms." The statement was deliberately ambiguous. It used the formal language of coalition diplomacy, the careful wording that could be interpreted multiple ways. And, in those few moments of confusion, the Zethian commanders took no immediate action. That 3-minute window of hesitation was all humanity needed. In the depths of the Atacama Desert, in an underground facility carved into the earth decades ago, General Patterson's successor, a woman named General Maria Gonzalez, initiated the first strike. The repurposed plasma cannon, modified with the frequency disruption technology that the research teams had developed, fired its first shot toward the Zethian flagship in Earth orbit. For the first time in Zethian history, one of their ships took a direct hit from human weapons. The shield flashed, destabilized for precisely 3.2 seconds, and the plasma bolt tore through the outer hull. Alarms shrieked through the Zethian vessel. The weapons were supposed to be disabled. Humans weren't supposed to have anything capable of piercing Zethian defenses. Yet here it was, reality disagreeing violently with their expectations. Across Earth, identical strikes were launched simultaneously from 7 different locations. No centralized command. No single point of failure. Each facility operated independently, targeting different Zethian vessels with perfect coordination. The attacks came from deserts, from mountains, from beneath oceans. From places the Zethians had assumed were empty of threat. The results were devastating. 3 Zethian warships were crippled in the first 30 seconds of the coordinated assault. Not destroyed, the human weapons weren't quite that powerful, but seriously damaged. Shields flaring, control systems failing, crew sections compromised. The Zethian military, which had faced no real opposition in over a century, experienced something novel and terrifying: actual opposition. In orbit, the Zethian tactical commanders reacted with shock. Then, with rage. Then, with the methodical precision that had made them the dominant military power in the coalition. They began transmitting orders to the remaining ships to launch a total planetary bombardment. If humans wanted to fight, the Zethians would simply destroy them all. It was the logical response. The only response. But, that's when the second phase of humanity's strategy became apparent. Dr. Chen had known from the beginning that they couldn't win a conventional war. The Zethians had more ships, more weapons, more everything. But, there was one thing that humans had always been uniquely good at: adaptation. And, there was one other thing that the Zethians had never truly had to deal with: an enemy willing to sacrifice everything. The moment the Zethian ships began charging their planet-strike weapons, thousands of objects launched from Earth's atmosphere. Satellites. Space stations. Old equipment. Things that humanity had left in orbit over decades of space exploration. Most of them weren't weapons at all. They were simply debris, accelerated into Zethian weapon ports using gravity assists and electromagnetic launchers. But they worked. The Zethian weapon systems, designed for targeting planets and large structures, had inadequate point defense against thousands of small, irregularly shaped objects moving at extreme velocities. 3 ships took catastrophic impacts and went silent. A 4th managed to deploy shields in time but was damaged enough to require immediate maintenance. The Zethian battle group, which moments before had seemed invincible, suddenly found itself unable to complete its primary objective. In the Situation Room beneath Washington, D.C., General Gonzalez watched the thermal imaging with careful optimism. They had hurt the Zethians. They had proven that human weapons could penetrate human defenses. But the battle was far from won. The Zethians would adapt. Their engineers would recalibrate their defenses. Their tactical commanders would develop new strategies. And they did, but humanity was already 3 steps ahead. The strategy had been developed by Colonel Murphy and Dr. Chen working together with a coalition of military strategists and scientists. The principles were ancient human tactics modified for space warfare. Use deception. Use false targets. Divide the enemy's attention. Don't fight them where they're strong, fight them where they're weak. Attack their assumptions more than their armor. The next phase of the attack came from a completely unexpected direction. Aboard the Zethian flagship itself, in the systems that had been designed to communicate with human representatives, a virus had been silently propagating for months. It wasn't particularly advanced. The coalition security systems should have been able to detect it instantly. But it had been built by human programmers who understood human psychology, and it had been hiding in plain sight as routine communication upgrades that the Zethians had approved without extensive examination. The virus activated, and it did something devastating. It locked the Zethian command crew out of their own ship's primary systems. For the first time in their existence as a spacefaring species, the Zethians experienced what it felt like to lose control of their own vessel. Alarms sounded. Commands weren't executing. The flagship, the pride of the Zethian fleet, was responding to no one. The crew of the ship, normally confident in their technological superiority, experienced something new: panic. On Earth, the humans watched this unfold through sensors and intercepted communications. They didn't cheer. There was no celebration. The faces of the military personnel in the command centers were grim and focused. They had succeeded in the first strike, but this was only the beginning. The Zethians would recover. They would regroup. They would bring their full military might to bear. And humanity had to be ready. In manufacturing centers across the world, engineers worked in shifts that had no beginning or end. 16 hours awake, 6 hours sleeping, then back to work. The plasma cannons were the primary weapon, but production was slow. The machinery was old. The parts had to be manufactured from scratch using specifications that had been hidden away for years. At maximum capacity, they could produce one functional cannon every 48 hours. And they needed dozens. But humans had another advantage that the Zethians had never properly accounted for: the ability to work together across all barriers. National borders meant nothing when extinction was on the table. Competitors became collaborators. Enemies worked side by side. Resources flowed across the planet based on need rather than politics. In Tokyo, survivors of the initial massacre worked alongside survivors of the bombardment of Lagos. In Russia, American engineers collaborated with Chinese scientists. In Australia, a secret facility that had been developing quantum computing for decades shared its technology with researchers in Brazil. The Zethians were a single empire with a unified command structure, which made them efficient and powerful. But it also made them vulnerable to something humans had learned the hard way over millennia: that rigid systems break under pressure, while flexible systems adapt and survive. By the second week of active conflict, 3 more Zethian warships had been damaged beyond functional status. The flagship had eventually freed itself from the virus control but had lost critical systems in the process. The Zethian tactical situation, while still advantageous, was rapidly deteriorating. More significantly, the Zethian morale was declining as they encountered something they had been convinced was impossible: effective human resistance. Dr. Chen stood in the command center in Switzerland, looking at the tactical display that showed Zethian positions and human countermeasures. Around her, maps displayed locations of every hidden weapon facility, every research center, every point in humanity's growing network of resistance. Colonel Murphy approached her with a tablet showing the latest intelligence reports. "The Zethians are preparing something," he said quietly. "Our analysts believe they're calling for reinforcements. Empire-wide communications have increased by 300%. They're scared." Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions at this statement. Pride, because humanity had actually frightened one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. But also trepidation, because scared enemies were unpredictable enemies. They would escalate. They would make decisions based on fear rather than strategy. They would become more dangerous. "How long until reinforcements arrive?" she asked. Weeks, if they're coming from the nearest coalition outposts. Months if they're coming from the Imperial core. But, the Zethians might not wait for reinforcements. They might decide to destroy Earth completely and blame the failure on some kind of cosmic accident. A planetary collision. A solar flare. Something that can't be verified. Sarah nodded slowly. She had been expecting this eventuality. The Zethians had the capability to destroy Earth if they felt sufficiently threatened. It was a final option, a scorched Earth solution, but it was available to them if their pride demanded it. Then, we have to make it so they can't afford to destroy Earth, Sarah said. Colonel Murphy's eyes narrowed. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about leverage. The Zethians care about power. They care about image. They care about their standing in the coalition. If we can find a way to make Earth's survival more valuable to them than Earth's destruction, we change the equation. She spent the next 6 hours sending coded messages through the resistance network to scientists and political figures who were in hiding. By the end of that period, something remarkable had been organized. A scientific paper, published anonymously through academic journals, describing a theoretical energy generation system that was based partially on Zethian technology but improved through human innovation. The paper was deliberately incomplete. It had gaps. Intentional errors that could only be corrected by further research. It was tantalizing to any advanced civilization that understood the potential applications. It suggested unlimited energy generation with minimal waste. It suggested technologies that could revolutionize space travel, weapons systems, and structural engineering. And it was completely real. The human research teams had actually developed the technology. They had just hidden it in plain sight, published in academic journals under the guise of theoretical research. The Zethians, monitoring human communications as they were, would find it. They would understand its potential. And they would realize that destroying Earth meant losing access to the technology. It was a gamble. It was betting that the Zethian need for power would overcome their need for vengeance. But it was also the best leverage humans had. As the paper spread through the academic and military networks of the coalition, reports came back that it was being analyzed at the highest levels of the Zethian government. The military tacticians were recommending continued bombardment. The political leaders were recommending negotiation. For the first time, there was disagreement at the highest levels of Zethian command. Sarah stood in a secure facility hidden beneath 300 meters of rock, watching the Zethian communications being decoded in real time. The Empire was fracturing. Not obviously. Not completely. But there were cracks. The certainty that had defined Zethian policy had been shattered by the simple fact that humans had fought back. Colonel Murphy entered the room with new information. More good news and bad news, he said, spreading out a physical folder in front of Sarah. Good news, the Zethians are sending their first diplomatic probe. They want to negotiate. Bad news, they're also deploying what our analysts believe is the first stage of their extinction-level weapons platform. They're hedging their bets. They want to negotiate, but they're also preparing to destroy us. Sarah felt the weight of what was coming. The next phase would be delicate. Humanity had proven it could fight. Now humanity had to prove it could be a valuable addition to the coalition rather than a threat that needed elimination. They had to be both strong enough to be respectable and willing enough to cooperate to be trustworthy. They had to be something new. Not the weak species that bowed. Not the resistant species that attacked. But a species that understood power and chose how to use it. Send the response, Sarah said. Tell them we're ready to negotiate. But tell them in a way that lets them know we're aware of their extinction platform. Let them understand that we're not desperate to survive. We're simply offering them the opportunity to benefit from a partnership instead of suffering the losses of continued war. The message was transmitted on coalition diplomatic channels, wrapped in the careful language of formal negotiation. But the subtext was crystal clear: humanity was ready to talk, but they were no longer playing nice. The response came back within the hour. The Zethian Chancellor, for the first time in recorded history, requested a direct communication with a human representative to discuss terms of coexistence. Not surrender. Not domination. But actual negotiation between equals. Humanity had forced the galaxy to acknowledge them not through technological superiority or military dominance. They had forced acknowledgement through sheer, stubborn refusal to be what everyone had decided they were. And, now, standing at the edge of a completely new era, Saracen understood what came next. The real war wasn't fought with weapons or shields or orbital strikes. The real war was being fought in the hearts and minds of all the species in the coalition. If humanity could survive this and build something from it, they could change the entire political structure of the galaxy. But, first, they had to survive the negotiations. And, the Zethians, being pragmatic above all else, were going to make it extremely difficult. The neutral station orbited between the Zethian flagship and the secondary human command center. It had been constructed 300 years ago as a symbol of coalition unity and peaceful cooperation. Now it was a stage for something far more significant, the moment when the weakest species in the galaxy sat down to negotiate with one of the most powerful, not as a supplicant begging for mercy, but as a combatant demanding respect. Saracen moved through the station's corridors, her security escort maintaining a careful distance. She wore the formal robes of a coalition representative, though few had ever seen a human in such attire before. Around her neck hung the insignia that designated her as a chief negotiator for the Earth government, a government that technically no longer existed in its previous form. The old hierarchies had collapsed the moment the Zethians attacked. What had replaced them was something new. Faster. More adaptive. Less bound by tradition and more focused on survival and innovation. Colonel Murphy was stationed in the observation room, watching through secure cameras as the negotiation team took their seats at the long crystalline table. Beside him stood analysts from a dozen countries, all working together for the first time in human history without barriers of nationality, ideology, or resource competition. They were unified by something more powerful than political systems, the knowledge that what happened in the next hours would determine whether humanity had a future as an independent species or as a footnote in someone else's history. The Zethian delegation entered with the same precise movements as always, their crystalline armor catching the station lights and refracting them into rainbow patterns. But there was something different about them. Their movements were slower. More careful. The weapons they carried seemed less an automatic statement of dominance and more a security precaution. They had learned, the humans realized, to respect an opponent. The Zethian Chancellor was not present. Instead, the delegation was led by Commander Vexthal, a military officer whose tactical failures had cost them 5 warships and countless crew members. Standing beside him was Councillor Tria, a political operative whose role was to find the diplomatic path that the military operations had failed to secure. Sarah stood as the Zethians seated themselves. Protocol called for humans to remain sitting. Protocol was one of the first casualties of the conflict. Standing was an assertion of presence, of equality. The councillor's light patterns flickered, the Zethian equivalent of a subtle expression acknowledging the gesture. The Zethian Empire extends its formal recognition of the human species as a combatant force of significant capability, Councillor Tria began, her translator converting the formal language into human speech. This recognition carries implications for how future interactions will be conducted. Sarah had prepared for this moment for weeks. The right words now could mean everything. Too aggressive and the Zethians would feel threatened and might accelerate their plans for planetary destruction. Too submissive and humanity would be back where they started, a species that played nice while being exploited. The human species acknowledges the Zethian Empire's military superiority, Sarah responded, each word carefully calculated. We do not claim to be stronger than you. But, we have demonstrated that we are capable of inflicting significant damage when our survival is threatened. This is a fact that must now shape all future negotiations. Commander Vexthal's light patterns flashed red, a sign of agitation. You destroyed valuable military assets. You killed Zethian personnel. You violated fundamental laws of coalition conduct. The Zethian Empire destroyed 80 million humans without declaration or warning, Sarah replied, her voice steady. The Zethian Empire violated every law of coalition conduct in a single afternoon. You killed my daughter. If we're discussing law and morality, we should be clear about who violated it first and in what manner. The room went silent. Emotion was not supposed to be part of coalition negotiations. Zethians, who operated primarily through calculation and strategic thinking, rarely encountered the kind of personal motivation that drove the human response. And yet here it was, the core of why humans had fought back at all. Not because they were strong, but because losing everything had stripped away all the rules they were supposed to follow. Counselor Tria made a sound that the translator rendered as a contemplative hum. Your response suggests that you cannot be deterred through threat of destruction. This is a tactical problem that requires reconsideration of our approach. It is, Sarah agreed. You cannot scare a species that has already lost everything. And you cannot destroy us without losing access to technology and resources that your own people now recognize have value. But you can work with us. You can offer humanity a place in the coalition where we are not subordinate, not dominated, but cooperative. This was the gambit. The real negotiation wasn't about weapons or territory or even apologies. It was about establishing what humans had never had before: legitimacy. A place in the galactic structure that wasn't defined by the permission of stronger species. Counselor Tria's light pattern shifted through multiple colors in rapid succession. She was communicating with the other Zethian delegates without speaking, using the crystalline patterns in her armor as a communication system. The humans had learned to recognize some of the patterns, though not all. This discussion was happening in real time at a level the human negotiators could observe but not fully understand. Finally, Counselor Tria spoke again. The Zethian Empire is prepared to offer formal ceasefire terms, pending resolution of the following matters. First, the human species will provide complete specifications for the energy generation technology discovered in your published research. Second, the human species will contribute appropriate reparations for destroyed Zethian military assets. Third, the human species will accept restrictions on weapons development that will prevent future incidents of this nature. Sarah had expected these demands, but the wording was significant. Restrictions on weapons development was exactly what the Zethians wanted, what they had tried to force before the massacre. But, now, it had to be negotiated as a mutual agreement, not an imposed rule. The human species can provide theoretical frameworks for the energy technology, pending agreements on intellectual property rights and profit sharing, Sarah countered. We cannot and will not provide the complete operational specifications without those guarantees. As for reparations, we are prepared to offer compensation for the destroyed Zethian assets, but it must be proportional. Your empire destroyed 3 human cities. 80 million humans died. The reparations for that loss would exceed anything we could reasonably provide. It was a bold move, essentially refusing to apologize for defending against genocide. But it was also honest in a way that coalition diplomacy usually wasn't. The Zethians had attacked without provocation. Humans had defended. Both sides had suffered losses. Pretending that the losses were equivalent would be a lie, and Sarah had decided that the Zethian respect for humans as an adversary was more valuable than their respect for humans as a compliant species. Commander Vexthal's light patterns flashed red again, and the translator detected aggressive undertones in his next words. You are in no position to negotiate from strength. But it was Counselor Tria who responded, overriding the commander's statement with a gesture of her own. The commander is correct in tactical assessment but incorrect in political assessment. We initiated conflict with a species we believed to be weak. Instead, we discovered a species of surprising resilience and creativity. From this point forward, ignoring human capabilities would be poor strategy. Sarah watched the power dynamic shift in real time. The counselor was politically maneuvering, using the human threat to justify a more pragmatic approach to the military commander's position. The Zethians were adapting, recognizing that humans had changed the rules of the game. The negotiations continued for 14 hours straight, breaking only briefly for biological necessities. Humans, it turned out, needed food and water and sleep far more frequently than Zethians, which gave them a disadvantage in endurance but also established a different kind of presence. The counselor began to notice that the human negotiators worked in shifts, with fresh minds replacing tired ones, while the Zethian delegation remained the same throughout. It was a tactical observation that suggested something the Zethians hadn't previously understood: human societies were built on collaboration and replacement, not on the assumption that the same individual would make all decisions forever. By the end of the 14-hour session, a framework had been established. Not peace, exactly, but a recognition of the new reality. The Zethian Empire would withdraw its extinction platform and most of its military assets from Earth orbit. In exchange, humanity would provide research collaboration on the energy generation technology and would agree to restrictions on weapons development that were mutual and verifiable by both sides. Neither species would be subordinate to the other. But the truly significant moment came when Counselor Tria made a statement that would be transmitted across the entire coalition. The Zethian Empire recognizes that the human species has demonstrated sufficient military and strategic capability to warrant reclassification in the coalition hierarchy. We propose elevating humanity from Tier 7 status to Tier 5, effective immediately upon signature of the peace accord. Sarah felt the room go still. The other human negotiators, watching from the observation areas, couldn't contain their expressions of shock and relief. Tier 5 status meant access to coalition resources. It meant representation in the governmental structures. It meant that humanity would be consulted on decisions that affected regional space. It meant that the genocide that had been attempted could not happen again, because a Tier 5 species had recourse and political allies. The human delegation accepts this proposal, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. What followed was less ceremonial than either species had expected. There was no grand signing ceremony. No dramatic declarations of eternal peace. Instead, there was the simple act of two species reaching an accord. Technicians exchanged documents. Legal representatives reviewed the terms. And, within 48 hours, the peace accord of humanity and the Zethian Empire was official. On Earth, the announcement came through emergency broadcast systems. In hospitals, in shelters, in homes where people had been living with the constant awareness of potential annihilation, the message was received: humanity had survived. And, more than survived. Humanity had risen. The celebrations lasted for 3 days. In some places, they began with tears, the grief for everything that had been lost, everything that would never come back. 80 million dead. 3 cities erased. Radiation poisoning that would take generations to fully resolve. The psychological trauma of knowing that your species had been targeted for extinction and had only survived through a desperate gamble. But, alongside the grief was something else. Pride. The knowledge that when humanity was pushed into a corner with everything to lose, they didn't break. They didn't submit. They became something dangerous. Something that even a galactic power had to respect. Dr. Sarah Chan received the official communication in the secure facility beneath Switzerland. She was being offered a position as the chief human representative to the coalition. A role that would require her to live on the coalition's central station, to represent humanity's interests in the governing bodies of the galaxy, to help determine the future direction of human civilization. She thought of her daughter, who would never see this future. She thought of the 80 million others who had been erased. And she thought of the responsibility that now fell on the shoulders of every surviving human. Colonel Murphy found her in the observation deck, looking out at the stars. Without a word, he handed her the preliminary reports from the manufacturing centers. They were building new ships. Faster ones. Better weapons. Defensive systems inspired by the Zethian technology but modified by human innovation. "What are we doing?" Murphy asked quietly. Sarah smiled, an expression of such complex emotion that it couldn't be captured in simple language. "We're becoming what they feared. Not a weak species. Not a dominant species. But a species that couldn't be ignored, exploited, or destroyed." The Zethian Empire spent the next months analyzing how they had been defeated. Not militarily, they still outgunned humanity significantly. But, strategically and politically, they had been outmaneuvered. Their mistake had been assuming that a weak species would remain weak. That a subjugated species would remain subjugated. That removing all the rules that held a civilization in check would simply make that civilization easier to control. They had not accounted for human creativity, human resilience, or human refusal to accept the definitions that others had written for them. Across the coalition, other species began to reconsider their own status and their own assumptions. Some who had accepted subordinate roles began to ask why. Some who had assumed their assigned place in the hierarchy was permanent began to look for ways to improve it. The Zethian massacre of humanity, intended to be a demonstration of power that would keep the lower species in line, became instead the catalyst that fractured the coalition structure entirely. A year after the massacre, humanity had joined the Inner Council as Tier 5 representatives. They brought with them both the energy generation technology and, something more valuable, the example that the old order could be changed. That strength wasn't infinite. That the rules could be challenged. 2 years after the massacre, humanity had established trade agreements with 7 different species and had begun trading in knowledge and resources that previously had been restricted to higher-tier species. The new technology that human scientists developed, drawing on human innovation applied to Zethian knowledge, began to spread across the coalition. Sarah Chen stood in the coalition chamber, the first human to ever address the governmental body. Around her were representatives of species that made humanity look fragile and primitive. Some of them still didn't believe that humans were truly Tier 5. Some still saw them as an aberration, a mistake in the system that would eventually be corrected. But it didn't matter what they thought. What mattered was that humanity was there. Humanity had earned the right to be there through blood and desperation and the refusal to accept that their future had to follow the lines drawn by others. The human civilization, Sarah began, speaking to the assembled representatives of dozens of species, has learned in the past 2 years that strength takes many forms. It can be military. It can be technological. But the kind of strength that matters most is the strength that comes from believing you have something worth fighting for. When your species faced extinction, we didn't break. We adapted. We overcame. And we proved that in a galaxy where power is supposed to be distributed by the ancient and the established, there is always room for a species that refuses to accept its predetermined place. The message was clear, though it was delivered in the carefully diplomatic language of the coalition: humanity was here to stay. And they would never play nice again. As Sarah returned to her seat, she received a private message on her secure terminal. It was from a research team in Japan, working on a new weapons system that didn't rely on any coalition technology. It was entirely human-made. Entirely original. And it was more efficient than anything the Zethians had produced in the last 100 years. Humanity wasn't just changing their position in the galaxy. They were changing the galaxy itself. 3 years after the massacre, Earth had become a center of innovation and technological development. The species that had once been classified as harmless and subordinate was now producing technologies that the most advanced species in the coalition wanted access to. The species that had once been forced to surrender their weapons development was now the leading manufacturer of next-generation weapons systems. But, more significantly, Earth had become something else entirely: a symbol. A symbol that the old order could be challenged. That destiny wasn't predetermined. That a species could choose to be more than what others decided they should be. In the Memorial Gardens of Tokyo, where 80 million people had once lived, humanity was building something new. Not to forget what had been lost, but to remember what they had become. And, around the galaxy, in 100 different species and 1,000 different worlds, others were watching and beginning to ask their own questions about whether they too had the strength to change the rules. The massacre hadn't ended with humanity playing nice. It had ended with humanity playing for keeps. And the galaxy would never be the same.